Welcome, everybody, to our Spring 2025 Lawns to Legumes Pollinator Lawns webinar. This webinar will be going kind of into the step-by-step specifics of converting from turfgrass lawn into a pollinator lawn. And we're grateful to be joined today by James Wolfin, who is a conservation specialist at Twin Cities Seed Company. He'll be presenting today. First, just a couple of housekeeping items. This is just a regular Zoom meeting format, so we ask that you please stay muted throughout the duration of the presentation. We will be recording this webinar and emailing it out to everyone afterwards if you do have to leave early. As I alluded to, we'll be starting with the presentation, but then whatever remaining time we have left, we'll be devoting that to Q&A. So if you do have any questions related to pollinator lawns that come up during the presentation, you can put them in the chat and we'll be going through those chat questions at the end. With that, James, I'm going to pass things off to you to get started.
Yeah, thank you, Megan, and thanks for everyone for virtually joining me today. It's a rather nice day for Minneapolis winter, kind of a fake preview to spring, but we'll get to talk about some of the things we'll be able to plant just a few short weeks from now. Focusing today on flowering bee lawns. For what it's worth, before working here, I was with Blue Thumb, and before that, I was a grad student at the University of Minnesota Bee Lab, where bee lawns was actually my grad student research project. So I'm pretty darn well versed in these, and you'll come to see I'm pretty passionate about them as well. And I hope that you'll feel the same way after this presentation. So I like to break this presentation up into three different sections, starting first with the cultural and ecological functions of the lawn, kind of a little bit of a background kind of context section of the presentation. From that, we'll move on to the elements of a bee lawn, kind of what are the building blocks of a bee lawn, and then finally how to actually install these, focusing on bee lawn installation, where something that you'll come to see is it's pretty easy to install a bee lawn, something that you can do by yourself in a matter of minutes or hours. So let's start with that background kind of context first, the cultural and ecological functions of the lawn. So I'm an ecologist by trade, and many folks are surprised to find that I apply that to the world of the turfgrass lawn. I'm sure when all of you think of ecology and conservation, the turfgrass lawn is one of the last green spaces you think of. That being said, why do we even have turf grass lawns? The primary reason is because they are a unique vegetative area in that they can withstand recreation. If you want to go out and play ball, if you want to have your friends over for a barbecue, if you want to play fetch with your dog, turf grass can take a beating, continue to grow and survive, and provide many of those ecosystem services associated with green spaces. With regards to turf grass lawns, pollinator lawns, and the types of plantings we'll be talking about today, how I want you to think of it is a bee lawn is by no means a substitute or an equivalent of a native pollinator planting. In the areas that you don't actively use within your yard, a native planting is always going to be superior. A pollinator-friendly tree and shrub is likely going to be superior as well. This is just a unique planting that can be applied to a green space where you desire foot traffic. If you want to take that backyard where the dog plays or the front yard that you mosey on through and add some low-growing pollinator-friendly flowers to that, that is kind of where this becomes applicable. Something that I would hope we could all agree on is that we have a whole lot of turf grass in the United States, about 50,000 square miles. Um, and that means that there's a whole lot of opportunity for us to do better. Perhaps some of this is unwarranted. We probably don't need all of this turf. But there are many folks, many families out there who get a lot of recreation and functionality out of their lawn. In those areas where you want to keep lawn, think of this as just a superior use. To get an idea of just how much turf grass we have in the United States, that 50,000 square miles is the equivalent of 2% of the continental US. And when we think of where those turf grass areas are most prevalent, if you look at those big splotches of green on that map I have on your screen, those all represent areas of high turf grass uh, prevalence. So if you look on the East Coast where I grew up, like Queens, New York, Northeast metro areas, a whole lot of green there. If you were to look at Southern California, you'd see a lot of green there. But even if you start to hone in on the Twin Cities area, you'll see that big old blotch of green and some more green spattered about the state, which means we have a whole lot of turf grass here in the Twin Cities, a whole lot of turf grass here in Minnesota, which means there's a lot of opportunity for us to kind of bring down that carbon footprint and also introduce some pollinator friendly forage for at-risk bees and other pollinators as well. So the basic idea behind bee lawns is we want to take that traditional turf grass lawn, that green carpet, and introduce a diversity of low-growing pollinator-friendly flowers. We're not just going to introduce any old flower like a creeping Charlie or other flowers that don't provide value to pollinators. We're being very deliberate with our plant selection here. And the overall goal is to create a matrix of grasses and flowers. So we're not fully eliminating turf grass. The turf grass still provides value. If you think about this, in terms of what your green spaces look like throughout the growing season, flowers come and go throughout the spring, summer, and fall. Turfgrass is kind of a nice uh, foundation to hold that area steady throughout the growing season. We'd never want to have bare spaces. We never want to have exposed soil in our lawns. That's just creating a big old runway for stormwater runoff and all sorts of other potential issues within the lawn. So the turf grass holds the area steady. The flowers come and go throughout the season to provide food for the pollinators. And the grasses and flowers combine to make a flowering lawn or a bee lawn. There are three primary goals of a bee lawn. We want them to be low maintenance, we want them to protect our pollinators, and we want them to help improve local water quality. When I say low maintenance or low input throughout this presentation, I'm going to be referring to three main things that all have an impact on our carbon footprint. So the benefits of a bee lawn, it's not just providing food for our pollinators, which of course is a tremendous focal point, but it's also tied to the conservation of natural resources. We want to use turfgrass species and flowers that have really strong drought tolerance. This is something that I used to have to go really quite in depth about. Then in 2021, 2022, and 2023, Minnesota decided it's not going to rain anymore here. Everyone wanted drought tolerant vegetation because drought tolerance is tied specifically to how frequently do I have to water this green space. The less we have to water it, the better it is for our environment. I'm sure no one wants their water bills surging all summer long because we have Kentucky bluegrass that needs to be watered every other day or something along those lines. We also want to use vegetation that has a slow vertical growth rate. Mowing, especially if you're using a gas mower, has a really heavy carbon footprint. What people don't realize is that there are grasses and flowers as well that we'll talk about today that grow much more slowly, that don't need to be mowed nearly as frequently. The types of plants that we're going to be talking about today, 2 to 6 mows per year. That really comes down to personal preference. You can absolutely get away with mowing these just 2 or 3 throughout the year, and perhaps a little bit more frequently if you desire that kind of aesthetic of a little bit more of a traditional aesthetic. But either way, these bee lawns are designed to reduce your mowing. And also low fertility needs. Again, going back to the traditional Kentucky bluegrass wants to be fertilized 3 times per year, putting down nitrogen and even sometimes phosphorus as well. Phosphorus is directly tied to algal blooms, eutrophication, things that are really messing up our lakes here in the Twin Cities, here in the state of Minnesota. What people don't realize, again, is that there are all sorts of plants that you can use that have a lower fertility need, that don't need that nitrogen and phosphorus, that can reduce our fertilizer applications throughout the year. Pollinator protection, I would hope this would be the most obvious of the bee lawn goals. These flowers are introduced because they specifically provide value, high quality food for bees and other pollinators as well. This means that the sugar content in the nectar is quite high, the protein content in the pollen is quite high. We are actively trying to attract pollinators back into our lawns with low growing pollinator friendly plants. And finally, how bee lawns can impact stormwater conservation, local water quality. I'd hope when you see this picture, the first thing that runs through your head is, my goodness, that is not what I expected a bee lawn to look like. And you would be exactly right. This is, in fact, a rain garden that was installed by Metro Blooms. And the reason I bring that up is whenever I'm talking with a resident, without fail, if they tell me that one of their goals is to reduce stormwater runoff, improve local water quality, I say that is fantastic. Let's go ahead and install a rain garden. A rain garden is typically a couple hundred square feet, maybe between 150 and 300 square feet, and there is a cost and labor associated with installing a rain garden. That being said, they are fantastic at capturing stormwater runoff. A rain garden is just a native planting with a kind of concave bowl-like shape, captures water really well, uses native plants with deep root systems that penetrate the soil, infiltrate water extremely well. But even if you were to install a couple rain gardens in your yard, The average urban suburban lawn area is several thousand square feet in total area. So if we went with just rain gardens and native plantings, there would still be a ton of space that is unaccounted for. So how I think bee lawns can play into this is in between those areas, in between those rain gardens and native plantings, etc. If you incorporate a bee lawn instead of a traditional turf grass lawn, you'll be utilizing flowering plants and grasses with much deeper root systems that infiltrate the ground better and therefore allow water to infiltrate the ground better as well. Less water running off your property, more water being infiltrated into the ground. To steal a line from Rich Harrison, one of the designers at Metro Blooms, he says we have to go away from our watershed mentality, where we try to shed water off our property, and instead go towards a water infiltration kind of mind. Take that water, allow it to soak into the ground, and those bee lawns vegetative species do a much better job of infiltrating water than your traditional turf grasses do. So that kind of gives a little bit of context as to why we have lawns, how bee lawns can help to improve your carbon footprint, and we'll talk more about all of that. But now what I want to do is talk about the individual elements of a bee lawn. What are the tools we use to create a bee lawn? So we want to start from the ground up, starting first with the turfgrass species that we use within a bee lawn. So to kind of get your idea of why does the turf grass even matter, let's kind of think about turf grass as not just an area that needs water and fertilizer, etc., but also how the different species of turf grass compare to one another in terms of how competitive they are. Because now we're trying to create a space where we want flowers to coexist alongside those grasses, which means we have to think about how competitive are these grasses? Are they going to let the flowers have space or are they going to exclude them? For example, if we were to consider a turfgrass species that grows really fast, has these thick, wide leaf blades, we would be at risk of creating a canopy over the top of these flowers, crowding them out, and having an area with low forb establishment, where forb is just a flower. So aggressive turf grasses, low floral establishment. Comparatively, if we were to use grasses that had a thinner leaf blade, slower rate of growth, this would work really nicely with flowers, or at least that's what we thought and what we tested at the University of Minnesota's Bee Lab. We wanted to see how different turf grasses would coexist with different floral species. So we put this into action. We took a common lawn flower, one of the clover species, interseeded it into four different types of grasses, the four most commonly used grasses in the cool season United States: Kentucky bluegrass, hard fescue, which is just a type of fine fescue, tall fescue, and perennial ryegrass. Now, what's important about these grasses is you'll notice two of them have a thinner leaf blade and a slower rate of growth, while the other two, the tall fescue and the perennial ryegrass, have a wider leaf blade and a faster rate of growth. So the hypothesis is that was that these more docile grasses, the ones with the slower rate of growth and the thinner leaf blade, would allow more flowers to co-establish alongside them. And that is exactly what we found at the Bee Lab, that the grass species you use absolutely makes a tremendous difference in terms of how are these flowers able to establish and how many blooms will you see. So those fine fescues and the Kentucky bluegrasses had nearly 8 times the number of blooms as compared to perennial ryegrass and tall fescue. What this means to you as you go to do this in your lawn, if you seed the right kind of grass into your lawn alongside the your bee lawn flowers, you will have way more blooms present in your yard. When we determine what's a better fit, the fine fescues or Kentucky bluegrasses, we totally settle on the fine fescues as undoubtedly being a superior species for a bee lawn because they are a much more low input species. So let's talk a little bit about the fine fescues and why they're such a great fit. So this is going to kind of combine natural resource conservation with pollinator health, feeding our pollinators. Fine fescues are truly the gold medal turfgrass species for reducing our inputs, for reducing our carbon footprint. They have a very low fertility need. In terms of an established fine fescue lawn, you will never need to fertilize them. If you simply let your clippings stay in your yard rather than collecting them after your mows, that's all the nitrogen that your fine fescue lawn will ever need. They grow extremely slowly. This is probably the most exciting part to most folks that use the fine fescues. The recommended mowing for fine fescue lawn is 2 to 6 mows per year. And finally, the drought tolerance of the fine fescues. They can get away with being watered once every 2 to 4 weeks. Uh, Much better than that of Kentucky bluegrasses. During the heat of summer, bluegrass probably wants to be watered every other day. The only negatives of the fine fescues is they have poor traffic tolerance. This doesn't mean that you can't have light recreation in a fine fescue yard. It's more so if you've got big dogs that are running around, or if you've got kids really tearing up the yard playing sports with cleats or something like that, you might want to incorporate a little bit of a more traffic tolerant species alongside the fine fescues. So that kind of gives us an understanding of the turf grasses that work within a bee lawn. Now let's jump into something a little bit more fun and talk about the floral species that work within a bee lawn. So there are a couple boxes that we need to check when figuring out what flowers are going to work nicely within a bee lawn. First and most obviously, we need them to be low growing. We're not going to come out here and say, hey, you know what's a great plant for bees? Lead plant. Lead plant is a wonderful species for bees. It also blooms at about 5 feet off the ground. Not exactly going to work in a lawn setting. The goal here is we want flowers that would bloom at absolute maximum 6 inches, ideally 3 or 4 inches or lower within your lawn. We want you to be able to have your cake and eat it too. Maintain that recreation that's associated with the traditional turfgrass lawn while introducing those low-growing pollinator-friendly flowers. It's not enough to just be able to establish. We also need you to be able to tolerate typical lawn management practices. What that means is you got to be able to be mowed. If we think about mowing from a plant's perspective, we are chopping off a large portion of your body and saying, now continue growing and blooming. This is not something that every flower can do. It took some trial and error to see what flowers respond well to mowing. And for the flowers that work well, what we found is that mowing can kind of be like an equivalent of deadheading. It can actually promote having more blooms in your yard. There's some really great research out of the University of Massachusetts that supports this. I encourage you to check that out if you're looking for a good read. But these flowers respond quite well to mowing. And of course, we want them to serve as high quality forage for bees. We're not throwing in flowers like Creeping Charlie that are really inconsistent forage sources, only flowers that provide consistent high quality rewards for our wild bee species. We're trying as best we can to incorporate native flowers. Native flowers can be quite expensive, and it's also just really difficult to find native flowers that work within a lawn. But the trials are continuous, and we're making improvements every year. What I think is important to remember is that not the origin of a flower doesn't make it inherently bad. It's absolutely more consistent if you can use native flowers that have co-evolved alongside native pollinators. That's always going to be a safer bet. But there are absolutely non-native flowers that provide high quality forage for pollinators. And those are the kinds of non-natives that we use within a bee. Self-heal is a beautiful native flower that is very commonly used within in a bee lawn. It's got these kind of medium whorled blooms. When I say a whorled bloom, that refers to the shape of the flower, the shape of each individual inflorescence. It's almost a little bit cupped, and what that cupping does is it kind of determines what kind of pollinators can use it. I'm an entomologist at heart. We're going to get a little bit down and dirty into the nerdy stuff of floral use by bees. If you're not interested in learning about how bees use flowers, you probably came to the wrong presentation. The literature suggests that self-heal is primarily a nectar source. We'll touch a little bit more on that later. And what's great about self-heal is it does really well in diverse soil types, dry soils, moist soils, and what's even better than that is it responds well to both sun and shade. Not necessarily deep shade. Um, with deep shade, there are flowers that can work in it. It's worth noting that pollinators prefer to forage in full sun areas or at least partially sunny areas. They're not like us, they're not warm-blooded. They get their warmth from the sun, which is why they prefer to feed in warmer, sunnier areas. Creeping thyme, almost the exact opposite of the self-heal in terms of how its inflorescence is shaped. Teeny tiny, wide open, fantastic for small bees. If you are a Minnesota gardener and you're thinking, my goodness, what can tolerate our dry summers and our intense, harsh winters, creeping thyme has fantastic drought tolerance and winter hardiness. Something that's a great benefit to folks maybe out of the Twin Cities. Natural deer deterrent. Deer do not like the scent and the taste associated with the vegetation. So if you're one of those gardeners who's like, these pesky deers are eating my tomatoes nonstop or eating my insert plant nonstop, some folks do like to use creeping thyme as a little bit of a border plant to keep the deer away. It's worth noting Creeping thyme is no longer allowed to be purchased as a straight species. There's some few exceptions there. Um, you can use it if it's going into one of two situations. If you're buying it as part of a bee lawn mix, or two, if you're purchasing it and you're showing the Lawns Legumes administrators, this is going into an area with sandy soils. Um, this is all part of an effort to really favor native species while also being understanding that Belon mixes are available, creeping times of species in those mixes. And two, if you've got these really sandy soils, your plant palette is inherently limited. They don't want to rip a species away from you that is known to do really well in sandier soils. Dutch white clover is another species that is fantastic for pollinators. This is both with the diversity of bees that it attracts and the quality of the food that it gives to those pollinators. Great source of both pollen and nectar, pollen that's super rich in protein content, nectar that's super rich in sugar content. Something else that's fantastic about Dutch white clover and why big box store seed brands used to include it in their lawn mixes. Dutch white clover is a natural nitrogen fixer. It takes that atmospheric nitrogen, fixes it back into the soil, and makes it available to the plants in your yard. This is obviously fantastic for you from a lawn management point of view. Fortunately, somewhere along the way, those big grass companies realized, what if we sold folks nitrogen in a bag instead? They realized there's a big money maker out of there. So now they market clover as a weed you should kill and try to sell you fertilizer on the side. We think it's much better if you look at this clover as a food source for bees that brings nitrogen back into your yard. Common violet, a species that's great for pollinators, but you won't be seeing it in too many pollinator lawn mixes. The reason for that is common violet spreads exceptionally well once it's in a lawn. What it does not do is produce bountiful seed. So it's a nightmare to try and harvest the seed from this plant. It is an angel in terms of its ability to spread throughout a lawn. What I would say here is if you've got it in your lawn, let it go. If you have a friend who has it in their lawn, ask if you could take a clipping, dig some out and throw it in your lawn. It will spread really nicely. It is stunning, gorgeous to look at. It blooms nice and early. And even more valuable than the food it provides bees, it's not all about food in the pollinator world. It's a really nice host plant for our pollinators. There are some species out there that will land on violet, its vegetation, lay eggs, and the larvae will develop on that flower. So I know I've been talking a ton about flowers as a food source for bees. Being a host plant is also extremely important, where there are some specialists out there that only want to lay their eggs on certain plant types. Some of them use common violet as a plant type that they will lay their eggs on. Something else that I always like to bring up is I have no idea how we were ever duped into thinking that a green carpet is the preferred and most beautiful option for a lawn. I personally think that flowers color is much more beautiful. I can assure you I have never given my fiance a vase full of turfgrass for Valentine's Day. I go the flower route. It goes really well for me. I don't think I'm going to change that up anytime soon. So if any of your friends and neighbors are saying, "What's with all those flowers in the lawn?" you could say, I find flowers more beautiful than grass, and I don't think that's too crazy. Um, a little bit more about who visits a bee lawn. So self-heal, we tend to see larger bees, bumblebees, megachilid bees, large chunky bees with long bee tongues that can stick their tongues within those whorled blooms, get their nectar, grab their pollen, and get on their way. We do see some smaller bees as well. So when we were doing the bee lawn research, we expected large bees. Long floral neck on a flower, long tongue, tons of research out there to support that. What we found out with these smaller bees is the teeny tiny little guys were crawling into the inflorescences, grabbing their nectar, grabbing their pollen, crawling out and flying away. So we kind of see this like two types, small bees, skip the middle, large bees on the self-heal. I also mentioned that the research suggested that self-heal was primarily a nectar source for bees. We also found some really exciting evidence to suggest that self-heal is a pollen source for bees. So in terms of why this is so exciting, kind of two main reasons. A lot of you, if you're concerned with pollinator conservation, you might have heard the term specialist bees, or bees that only feed on a few different types of flowers. This really focuses exclusively on pollen. Bees are no different from small children, from toddlers. They will get their sugar, they will get their nectar from just about any flower out there. You give a kid a lollipop or a donut, they're happy, they get their sugar, they're on their way. When it comes to protein, I don't know, maybe they only want chicken nuggets or something like that. Bees aren't too different. There are some bees out there that are like, hey, I'm only getting my protein from this floral genus, this floral species, this floral family. So when we saw that a bee, this one right here, Bombus bimaculatus, was doing combing behavior, the brushing of its hairs to push pollen down into the pollen sacs, that was super exciting. It means, hey, you're not just getting your sugar fix, you're getting your pollen, and that's really exciting. Another little dive into being a pollen nerd. I am absolutely a pollen nerd. It was a huge part of my research as a student. Um, in terms of floral reproduction, what allows flowers to produce their babies? Pollen is the sex cell, is the essentially the sex cell of the plant world. Pollen being transferred from species A to species B, or excuse me, individual A to individual B within the same species is what allows flowers to reproduce. So if we're thinking what's going to be great for allowing more flowers to exist, pollen collection promotes pollen transfer, promotes pollination. It's as simple as that. So if there's going to be one takeaway you have about self-heal in terms of its value to pollinators, I would hope it would be this. More than 95% of the visitors that we saw on self-heal were native species. In this program, we're absolutely placing an emphasis on the conservation of our native pollinators. So the fact that more than 95% of the visitors to this flower were shown to be native, extremely exciting. Creeping time here, no big surprise like with the self-heal. We saw exactly what we expected. Small, teeny tiny bees on these little teeny tiny wide open flowers. What you're seeing here is a bee from the species Augochlora. These teeny tiny green sweat bees, gorgeous to look at. And we also saw some really tiny black sweat bees from the genus Lasioglossum. There were some others, spattered in here and there, but primarily these smaller bees. What I think is really exciting about this flower is when it blooms. If we were to think about our pollinator gardens, tons of flowers blooming in those core summer months, June, July, August. In terms of what does the heavy lifting in the spring, it's our pollinator-friendly trees and shrubs. Lots of folks are huge proponents of no mow May. I think they have the absolute best intentions. They're looking at those pollinators on the ground, on those dandelions. I often encourage folks to lift their head up 45 degrees. Pollination in the spring is really going nuts in those pollinator-friendly trees and shrubs. Huge swaths of blooms during that window of time. So that covers kind of your spring with the pollinator-friendly trees and shrubs. The summer is covered by your gardens. But as we start to get later into the year, there's a little bit of a scarcity of blooms, which is why creeping time is so valuable. It blooms very late into the year, into September. As the climate is seeing more irregularities, we're even seeing it bloom into October sometimes. So here we're having a species that blooms and provides flowers to bees much later in the year when there's less food out there. So if there's one thing I want you to remember about creeping time, it's the latest to bloom of all the bee lawn flowers. It's feeding our bees when there's not too much food out there. Dutch white clover, diversity is the name of the game here. We see all sorts of small, large, medium-sized visitors. This is an agapostemon, one of my favorite bee genuses. I'm still a little kid at heart. I like shiny green things. Some solitary mining bees, some bumblebees, and even honeybees. It's worth noting that in the world of bee conservation, we're primarily talking about our native bees. Honeybees are more like domestic livestock. That being said, it doesn't mean that honeybees don't provide value. They're absolutely incredibly important pollinators, both in nature and in agriculture. But the focal point of this project of Lawns Legumes is really more focused on the native bees. So what's important for you to remember is that this flower provides food for a ton of native bee species and also honeybees as well. It's kind of like a little side benefit. So if there's one thing I want you to remember about the Dutch white clover, it's that it is a critical source of forage for honeybees and native bees alike. To put a number to that, we've seen more than 55 bee species on Dutch white clover alone just in Minneapolis. That does include honeybees. It also includes more than 50 native bee species. So the vast majority of the bee species that we're seeing on Dutch white clover are native bee species. In terms of the total diversity of bees that we see on the bee lawn flowers, more than 65 bee species. That's good for more than 10% of the bees in all of Minnesota. And keep in mind, sampling was limited to exclusively Minneapolis for this survey. So it's possible that the diversity is even well beyond that. A little bit about these bee lawn mixes. The self-heal, the Dutch white clover, and the creeping thyme are the three species that were traditionally found in bee lawn mixes. Partially through launched legumes and partially through just simply consumer demand for the use of more native species. A new flower that's being introduced widely now is yak yarrow. Yak yarrow is closely related to the commonly used in the native plant gardening world, common yarrow. It is a naturally occurring subspecies of common yarrow, so a native species that stays lower to the ground than the common yarrow. It's attractive to diverse groups of pollinators. It has exceptional drought tolerance. It blooms nice and low, about 4 inches off the ground. And something that's really nice from the residential point of view, it is so easy to get this species established. Creeping time can be a little bit picky. It likes its sandier soils, it likes its sunnier sites. Yak yarrow is just a little bit more adaptable. So that, combined with being a native plant, a species that folks are really excited to get into their lawns. When I started doing these kinds of presentations for Metro Blooms and Blue Thumb, the very first piece of advice they gave me was, James, you can't keep using so many figures and data. People don't care about them. Just let me have one. Something that actually is studied out there is how low input, how eco-friendly are the different species that get used as vegetative cover. So being compared to turf grass, where there's tons of folks out there that want more low input, eco-friendly species. Yak yarrow was in fact one of the species that was studied. And when it comes specifically to drought tolerance, yak yarrow is a superstar. Does great in Minnesota, does great in the Midwest, one of the top species across the board, even when you include turf grasses, for its performance in low input trials, according to the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. When lots of folks tell me that they want to do an alternative yard, scrap their turfgrass altogether, they most commonly use Dutch white clover, which, as you can see on this graph, was one of the lowest performing species. If something that you want to do is scrap turf altogether, get in some flowers instead, yak yarrow is an even better bet than Dutch clover. And truthfully, diversity is always going to be your best bet. Those two species in tandem are going to make a great combination for a totally alternative lawn, a turf grass free lawn kind of option. If you are one of those folks that are out there and you're like, hey, I love pollinators, my partner, my roommates, whoever, they might not be so keen on this idea. They couldn't give a hoot about pollinator health. I'm yet to meet someone who doesn't care about food, local food production, things of that nature. There's some really great research out there that suggests that if you convert just 5% of your green space into pollinator friendly options, you will see improvements in pollination in your local urban gardens and local urban farms. So if anyone needs a little bit more firepower to get folks to get on the bee lawn bandwagon, support your local urban gardeners, support your local urban farmers. They will see benefits from including more pollinator-friendly options. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to get these installed and maintained. Hopefully, we all see bee lawns are great. They're going to improve our natural resource consumption. They're going to improve our pollinator health by providing really great rewards for them. It all means diddly squat if you can't get it in the ground. So let's talk about the timing of this. I would say if there's one thing you remember from the installation section, try to keep the proper timing embedded in your head here. It is so important. 3 periods of time that we're going to talk about that are great, one period of time that I'm going to beg you to steer away from. So the early spring, just after the snow melt, not quite right now. What we want is whenever you open up your weather app or whenever you turn on the news and you see that 60-degree temperatures, highs of 60 degrees are the norm. That is what we're looking for. Consistent highs of 60 plus means that soil temperatures are going to rise into the 50s. That is the temperature that our plants need in order to germinate from seed. So just after the snow melt, the good thing about seeding then is it gives our plants a nice early start in terms of collecting what's called degree days, or an accumulation of warmth that's required for plant germination. The second period of time that I love is the transition from summer to fall. When I'm talking to Minnesotans, I just simply say state fair season. Anywhere between August 15th and September 15th is absolutely fantastic. When we're getting those combinations of warm days and cool nights, that's exactly what we're looking for. The one thing that could create a little bit of difficulty here, if we happen to get a really, really early first frost, it could create some difficulty for our flowers. Plants typically want 6 weeks of germination prior to the first frost. So if we were to have a super early first frost, like the extremely famous Halloween blizzard that every Minnesotan I've ever met tells me about, that could potentially spell trouble for your bee lawn species. And finally, the third window that works exceptionally well is a dormant seeding. If any of you are average Joes just like me, you don't have irrigation set up in your yard, watering your bee lawn might be a little bit cumbersome. You want something that's a little bit less water intensive. The beauty of a dormant seeding in the late fall, you get your seed down just before that first hard frost, the snow that you know is going to stay for the year because you see that those temperatures are going to dip. The snow isn't going to melt anytime soon. The benefit here is that the snow melt the following spring is going to keep your seeds so nice and moist that you don't have to water nearly as much. Should things go a little bit dry in the spring, absolutely turn on the irrigation system. It will help. But for the most part, the snow melt is going to do a great job of keeping that seed moist, allowing it to establish. Without a doubt, there's year-to-year variation in how well this works. These past 2 years are couldn't be a better example of that. 2024, we didn't get a true snow cover. It was not a true Minnesotan winter. We didn't get that snow melt to keep our seed moist. This year, we just got 7 inches of snow in that transition from February to March that's going to keep our seeds so nice and moist. So if you did a dormant seeding this past fall, lucky you, it's going to work out real nice. If you do a dormant seeding this coming fall, you'd hope for a fall just for a winter just like the one we just had. One more great thing about a dormant seeding, the snow cover is almost like a free germination blanket, helps to keep the seed in place. So through that freeze thaw cycle, the snow keeps the seed in place, the freeze thaw works it into the soil. So I mentioned the timings that I like. Now I'm going to beg for the one that you stay away from. Without a doubt, when folks have trouble with uh, B-lawn seeding, one of the most common reasons is they try to seed this in the middle of the summer when it's 90 degrees out, and it is just near impossible to keep your soil, to keep your seeds moist and allow them to germinate. Seeds will only be able to germinate if you keep them moist. Doing so when it's 90 degrees is way harder than doing it when it's 65 degrees. So if you can avoid mid-June, mid-July, early August when we're getting our hottest temperatures of the year, your water bill will thank you, your flowers will thank you, etc. So in terms of how we actually get those seeds in the ground, you can do this as either a new lawn renovation or an overseeding. An overseeding is a lot easier, but it requires certain conditions. Particularly, we want you to have the right type of grass present in your yard, Kentucky bluegrass or fine fescue ideally. It's worth noting that greater than 90% of Minnesota lawns are planted with Kentucky bluegrass or fine fescue. That's typically not too big of a problem. What is sometimes a little bit more problematic is a B-lawn seeding is going to work much better in areas with low weed presence. Weeds in the yard are biological competitors of the flowers you're looking to get introduced through your B-lawn mixtures. So it's worth noting that if you have the wrong grass species or a lawn that's really overcome, burdened by weeds, you might be better off doing this as a new lawn renovation. But let's talk about both real quick, both overseeding and a new lawn renovation in terms of how do we make our bee lawn a reality. So for an overseeding, where we're remembering limited weeds and the right type of grass present. Step one, you mow that lawn nice and low. Step two, you rake away the clippings. And what steps one and two do together combined is they expose the soil. Seeds only germinate when they make contact with the soil and get moisture. So doing those first two steps leads to exposed soil. Three, nice and simple, you spread the seed throughout the area. Some folks will use compost or sand as a bulking agent alongside the flowers to help spread the seed more easily, kind of allow them to stay plush against the soil. This goes double if you buy a B-lawn seed mix that is just flowers, so not a combination of grasses and flowers. You absolutely want to use a bulking agent. After that, the key is you keep the area moist for the first 3 weeks and cut back on watering and fertilizing thereafter. What I tell folks all the times about bee lawns is they require 3 weeks of hard work, diligent watering, and if you do that hard work through the first 3 weeks, you get years of easy thereafter. Bee lawns are super low maintenance once they're established. A couple little notes on maintenance. We'll talk about maintenance more in a few slides. One, never mow below 3 inches. These flowers start to bloom at 3 inches. If you mow at 3 inches or higher, you will have consistent blooms throughout the growing season. Be sure to trim them back in the fall. If you can do just one mow, have it be mid-October or so, just before things really start to cool down here in Minnesota. And finally, never apply herbicides to a bee lawn. Just because you know which flowers you like and the flowers you don't like, that does not mean that the herbicides do. Herbicides are just going to kill those bee lawn flowers you worked so hard to get established. So we try to recognize that not everyone is going to have these optimal conditions for bee lawn establishment. Some of you are going to have to start from scratch. So let's talk about how to do a bee lawn as part of a new lawn renovation. To start the process, you got to tear that turf away, which doesn't require either a monetary investment or an investment of effort, but what you will get is improved overall results. The reason for that being this seed is going to make direct contact with the soil, which leads to perfect conditions for germination. So, how do we actually remove that vegetation? We'll talk about a few different methods here. First, a shovel or a sod cutter. A shovel, I honestly, the amount of area that the individual in this picture did is quite astonishing. It is a whole lot of work to turn your soil with just a shovel. Um, Kudos to that individual. You would never catch me doing an area that big with just a shovel. I'd much I'd be much more likely to look like the individual on the right using a sod kicker. Sod kicker, as simple a device as there is, it's a blade that runs underneath your turf, tears it out like carpet. Really great tool. Metro Blooms uses it all the time. If you want to do this true DIY, just you and your effort, these are two options to consider. I'd say they're probably better fit for smaller projects. If you want to do a DIY project that's a little bit larger, I highly recommend renting some machinery. There's all sorts of great small equipment shops around the state of Minnesota. A sod cutter or even a dingo, like what you see on the right, that little plow of sorts that just rips the vegetation away. Those are going to save you so much time. They do require a little bit of a monetary investment, but still likely more cost effective than hiring the job out. There are also some fantastic cultural methods you could use to get rid of the vegetation. I'll talk about two briefly, but what I'm really going to do is if you want to read more about these options in greater detail, the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation has a fantastic organic site preparation guide that goes into fantastic depth on these different strategies. So, a little bit on solarization. You cover the area you wish to convert with some clear plastic. You tamp it down with rocks or stakes or whatever you choose. And over time, heat is going to collect underneath that plastic. It's going to get hot enough where it's going to kill the vegetation underneath. And over the course of at least 3 months, that vegetation will be fully eradicated. You'll pull the plastic up and rake away the dead vegetation. So, something that is probably rather obvious, the sunnier the area, the faster this process will proceed. We recommend at least 3 months, and the Xerxes guide provides even greater depth and information there. Sheet mulching, or something that I affectionately call lawn lasagna. How this process works is you mow the turfgrass area down to the lowest height possible, and then you incorporate layers of compost, cardboard, and soak in between. What that'll do is it'll really smother that turfgrass, what's left of it at least, um, present in the lawn area or whatever area you're converting. That cardboard is going to break down over time, create a nice, really rich organic material. And year one, a lot of folks will incorporate a cover crop into the area they're sheet mulching. And year two and beyond, you'll start to see your bee lawn flowers, or truly whatever your desired vegetation is, start to take over. Sheet mulching works great for a bee lawn, works great for a native planting. If any of you are members of a Master Gardeners program, you're probably no stranger to sheet mulching. This is just your quick 60-second outlook on both solarization and sheet mulching. There's much more detail to this, just not something that we have enough time for in today's presentation. If those two methods sound exciting to you, definitely give it a little bit more of a read up. Believe it or not, there is some science behind how to seed a lawn. We recommend what's called a perpendicular seeding, meaning that you seed half of your mix walking in the north and south direction, the other half of your mix going in the east and west direction. So if you buy a beautiful bee lawn mix from one of your favorite garden centers, you see that the seeding rate is 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Spread 2.5 pounds walking north south, 2.5 pounds walking east west. You've done your job. We do recommend lightly raking the seed into the soil. I've learned this lesson the hard way. At the house that I rented with some buddies as a graduate student, you bet I installed a bee lawn. Within 15 minutes of me dropping the seed because I did not rake it in, birds were just going to town on it. I had just created a really expensive bird feeder. Luckily, some of the feed's still established, but not nearly as much as what would have established had I done that light raking to get the soil worked in, to get the seed worked into the soil. Watering, by far the most important part of this bee lawn establishment experience. We recommend one heavy watering directly after seeding, and after that, a light and frequent watering program. The absolute minimum that you should water during those first 3 weeks is every other day, 3 times per week. You can reduce your watering to a great extent after germination, but these plants are really going to need your help during that establishment germination window. Ideal watering would be 3 times a day, 5 minutes per watering event. If even if you can just squeeze in, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, perhaps right before you leave for work, right after you come home from work, that'll work wonderfully. Something else that I want to talk about is germination blankets. Germination blankets can be extremely valuable to new plant to seeding projects. It does a couple things. First, it helps to keep your seed in place. This is really important if you have a sloped area and you don't want the seed to blow off or get washed away. Two, germination blankets help with moisture retention. If you know, hey, I'm not going to be able to get out there 2, 3 times a day, I'll maybe get out there every other day or once a day. A germination blanket, as you can see in the picture, it's going to limit the amount of direct sunlight that makes contact with the future green space. So putting this down will help to keep the area moist for longer. Germination blankets can be found locally, not super expensive, and can be a really huge benefit to bee lawn establishment and germination. If you want to do this from scratch, let's talk a little bit about that. AKA, if you're in an area that's got the wrong turf grass or it's got a ton of really aggressive weeds, we're starting from scratch. So step one, remove that turf by hand, machine, or cultural method. Any of the methods we discussed today are just fine, and there's more out there as well. Step two, not necessarily needed, but recommended in many cases. Adding a soil amendment like some compost or anything rich in organic matter can be quite helpful. Since you've got the soil exposed, could be a really great idea. Three, spread your seed and likely rake it into the soil. Uh, this is extremely important for when you're starting from scratch. If the area is wide open, birds are absolutely going to be able to get in there and pick out your seeds real easy. So definitely either cover it by raking or cover it with a germination blanket. Do something to ensure that the seed isn't just exposed out there. After that, you want to keep the area moist until sprouting. Again, the most important part of your germination journey. Ideally 3 times per day, 2 times per day, or at a bare minimum every other day. And the maintenance is all the same, whether you do this as a new lawn installation or a overseeding kind of project. So a little cut sheet for you on kind of some of the conditions associated with the new lawn renovation versus an overseeding, kind of some cost benefit analysis, if you will, the pros and cons of an overseeding as compared to a new lawn renovation. We're not going to go over it too much here. This is more something for you to refer back to as you're trying to figure out, hey, how do I want to attack this project? Ongoing maintenance. Lucky for all of us, this is going to be the shortest component of today's presentation because bee lawns are pretty easy to maintain. That being said, we'll go through it all. So again, I just want to hammer in that fact that the establishment window is by far the most important window of that bee lawn journey. Water frequently, ideally daily. Even outside of that germination window, if you can water once or twice a week during dry periods, that would be highly recommended. And if you can, get out there and weed 2 or 3 times a year if you've got a lawn that you know is prone to weed infiltration. All those weeds are biological competitors of your bee lawn flowers. Doing what you can to keep those weeds in check is going to be highly beneficial. Mowing. There might be folks out there that don't agree with me. I would rather do quite literally anything else on a beautiful, sunny Minnesota spring, summer, fall day than mow my yard. Bee lawns want to be mowed less frequently than a traditional turf grass lawn. 2 to 6 mows per year is what we recommend. What you might notice is you'll be mowing a drop more in the spring and the fall, a little bit less in the summer. Cool season plants tend to grow fastest between ambient temperatures of 60 and 75 degrees, grow slower during temperatures hotter and colder than that. Something that I've said quite a bit about the No Mow May initiative is it has the absolute best intentions in the world, but perhaps flawed execution. Firstly, it's much better to mow a little bit less all the time than to arbitrarily pick a month because of alliteration and say, this is when we're going to stop mowing. That goes double when you select the month that is the fastest or second fastest window of growth for vegetation. If you wanted to pick a month where, hey, this is where I'm making my stand, this is where I'm not mowing, July would be a great pick. Scorching hot, plants grow slowly. All mowing is going to do is stress out those plants. But that being said, the main point here is bee lawns, we mow them less, makes the plants happy. 2 to 6 mows per year is wonderful. Most folks will do not most, many folks will do a height-based mowing regime that states that you never cut off more than 1/3 of the total plant height. What I try to do with my own bee lawn that I've got at home, I let it grow out to 6 inches, cut it back to 4 inches, keeps my plants very happy, gives me bountiful blooms throughout the year. Fertilizer. The only instance where I would ever consider fertilizing a bee lawn is during that germination window. There are fertilizers called starter fertilizers that give some phosphorus to our plants. Phosphorus is an essential nutrient for root development. Should you choose to do that, that's fine. Should you choose not to do that, if you have nice soil, it's probably not going to need the starter fertilizer. Um, Other fertilizers, general upkeep fertilizers, are primarily applications of nitrogen. B-lawn mixes contain clover, fixes nitrogen back into the soil. B-lawn mixes have a very low nitrogen requirement. So I would never apply a granular fertilizer or a liquid fertilizer to my B-lawn. I would let the clover do the heavy lifting. I would let the clippings do the heavy lifting. Irrigation. Bee lawns want to be irrigated less than your typical traditional turf grass lawn. Um, Again, sticking with logic here, you water a little bit more in the summer when it's hot, a little bit less in the spring and fall when it's a little bit cooler. In the spring and fall, I would say you'll typically water once every 3 weeks. Every time it rains, you restart that timer, and a little bit more frequently in the summer. What I mean by restart that timer, let's say we've gone 11 days without rain. We're thinking, hey, might need to water soon. If we get a rain event on day 12, bang, we're back to zero. Restart your timer in terms of when do I need to irrigate my bee lawn. Thatch removal. This is something that you might want to consider adding to your maintenance regime, especially if you're going with a super laid back mowing approach. Thatch is kind of this buildup of breaking down vegetation between your soil layer and between your actively growing plants. Too much thatch can make it difficult for roots to penetrate, get their nutrients, get their water, etc. What's recommended here is if you really go with a laid back mowing regime, consider using a dethatcher once per year in like mid to late spring, like, early mid-May. Dethatcher is going to pull that thatch out of the ground, create more breathing room for your plants, make it easier for those roots to penetrate and get the nutrients they need. Should you create a little bit of thinness or patchiness through that dethatching, just so a little bit more seed into the gaps. But again, we like to think that cutting your mowing tremendously makes one dethatching per year well worth it. And with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Great, thank you, James. Um, we do have some questions that people submitted in the chat throughout the presentation, which I can go through. Um, First, Patsy asked, when belawns do need mowing, is there a best time of day to mow in order not to harm or kill the insects feeding on the bee lawn?
Um, so I'll touch this from kind of two angles. Bees are typically most active like between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., pretty much when it's warmer out and they can get the warmth they need to comfortably forage. That being said, they're gonna fly away from your mower. People are out there mowing all different times throughout the day. They're not just gonna stand there and succumb to the blades where the city of Minneapolis is out there mowing just when they can get to it, and we never saw bee lawns with limited pollinator activity or like kills of swaths of dead bees in the bee lawn because they were getting caught up in mowers. So I'd say I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Okay. Next, Jenna asked, can you recommend florals for sandier soil And do you recommend amending or adding soil if the lawn is compact?
Yeah, again, something I'm going to attack from two angles. This is a fun one. So, sandy soils, your two best friends, three best friends, are going to be Dutch clover, yak yarrow, and creeping thyme. Those are flowers that just do exceptionally well in sandier soils. It's really neat how B-lawns can look so different from one ecoregion to the next. If you're in the Twin Cities where, we don't have the sandiest soils typically, of course, there's diverse soils in the Twin Cities. You'll see a lot of clover and self-heal in those B-lawns, maybe a drop less on the creeping thyme. But once you go out into the Anoka sand plains, it is creeping thyme territory. The sandier species, the more dry soil adapted species like the thyme and the yarrow do great. So if you are in an area with that sandier soil, thyme, yarrow, clover are going to be your best friends. The self-heal should still survive and flourish. You might just need to apply a little bit more water because it doesn't have quite the same drought tolerance. In terms of what to do with compacted or hard soils, aeration is going to be your best friend. This is actually something that we studied at the University of Minnesota, how aeration impacts the establishment of the different beeline flowers. What we found is that at worst, it's a net neutral, and at best, it is a tremendous benefit. And the thing that determined how it impacted floral establishment was soil compaction. If you've got those highly compacted clay soils, aeration is a blessing for those bee lawn flowers. Decompacts the soil, makes it so much easier to get those roots going, get those plants going. If you've got this beautiful, rich soil, sand and black dirt, etc., then it's really not going to make too big of a difference. It's going to be that net neutral, maybe a slight benefit.
Great, thank you. Um, Next, we have Kathy wondering about how belongs hold up to active dogs.
Yes, not wonderful. Not wonderful. At my own home, I do low input wear tolerant grass in the backyard where my dog plays fetch as much as we'll let him. In the front yard where it's lower traffic, that's where I do my bee lawn. If you've got a dog that's not just, going out tinkling and coming back in, if you've got a dog that's really playing out there, tearing things up, playing fetch, the recreation that is why we have lawns in the first place, yeah, I would probably stick with a more traditional turf back there and use the bee lawn options in areas that see light to moderate recreation.
Great. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, Katina asks, they have black locusts sprouting and shooting up all over their lawn. They live in a small town with a small lot, and it's in their neighbor's lawn on all sides. Any advice on how to manage this with a bee lawn? They've had a lot of difficulty pulling it out by hand and are wondering if mowing is enough or if that just would encourage it to grow back more.
Yeah, yeah. I'll be the first one to admit I am not a certified expert in black locust removal, but what I do know is that Blue Thumb and Metro Blooms has a fantastic team of sustainable land care experts where part of their knowledge base is um, recommendations on how to safely and smartly remove weedy species in an eco-friendly manner. For some species, mowing is enough to do the trick. Some species you can pull out with ease. Others a lot more difficult to pull out. Talking to you, Creeping Charlie. I would reach out to the folks at Blue Thumb. They'll be able to give you a much more precise and educated answer on that one, where I just haven't dealt with black locust enough in my own personal efforts.
Great. Yeah, what I'll do in that case, I'm going to put a link to Metro Bloom's Design Builds
Mhm.
consultations page if you want to kind of speak more further with an expert. Another source that you might have help with is the University of Minnesota Extension Master Gardeners. They might have more input on black locust specifically, and I do know that they have a lot of web pages dedicated to different weedy species too. Um, but there's the link to our consultations page. We also, if you're not in the metro area, we have a partner finder on the Blue Thumb website, and we have other great sustainable landscaping companies that could provide expertise as well. So I'll put that in a moment too. Okay. Next question is from Eileen, asking if deer are a problem or consideration when protecting new bee lawn seedings. Um, Similar to birds, if deer might be a similar culprit for eating the seed.
Similar but different. Deers can absolutely be beeline pests, but not because they like the seed. Um, Part of what the company that I work at does is forage seed. I want to attract animal X. What do I feed them? Dutch white clover and all the other clovers are textbook. Let's get the deers fed species. Deers like low growing vegetation that can come back after grazing, aka the exact species we're using here in these bee lawns. At least someone would be eating it. But yeah, deer are going to eat the clover. They might eat some of the other species as well. If you remember from the slides, creeping thyme is a useful species to keep them away. They do not like thyme. They do not like the scent. They do not like the taste, etc. So perhaps if you know, hey, I've got these deer problems, work some thyme in there. And birds, correct. Birds are going to feed on some seeds. That's why we highly recommend covering the seed in some way. A light rake, a top dressing with some compost or a similar bulking agent. Um, Something along those lines. And did you already touch on the dog thing? I see that as a separate comment from Eileen.
Yeah, wondering if dog urine might be a problem too.
Dog urine can be a problem in any lawn. Um, this is it. I find it interesting, at least. Female dogs tend to be a bigger issue than male dogs. Male dogs are sprayers. They lift that leg and it goes wherever nature sees fit. Girl dogs are more precise. They squat and they really concentrate that urine into one specific area. Um, Dog urine contains a ton of nitrogen. Nitrogen in the right quantity is fantastic for plant health. Nitrogen in excess is going to kill the plants. If you've got a female dog that goes in the same spot consistently, very high chance that it'll kill whatever vegetation is present. Bee lawn, turf grass, the works.
Um, okay, Kathy is wondering how well do belawns handle boulevard strips? Thinking about road plowing in the winter with one.
Yeah, I promise I did not plant Kathy in the audience to like softball me questions that I want to answer about Belons. This wonderful, fantastic organization that I know of, Metro Blooms, did a specific Belon project focused in boulevards in North Minneapolis. The reason why they went with Belons as a planting option in those boulevards is because they actually have really strong salt tolerance, which tends to be one of the main limiting factors within a boulevard strip. Fine fescues, the grasses that are used in the Belon have strong salt tolerance. These plants that are used in the Belon mix are the more kind of resilient plants out there that can just take a beating. I would say a boulevard strip is a fantastic option, especially when we consider that many boulevard strips have height restrictions in terms of how tall you can make a planting. To shout out Blue Thumb and Metro Blooms again, they have great plant palette suggestions for boulevard strips. So if you want to go the beeline route, that's great. If you want to go the native plant route, that's great. Just try to be mindful of the height of the plants you choose. But yeah, a beeline is a really nice option for the boulevard strips. I would hope that the plow doesn't crush you too much there. There's only a certain amount of damage that any plant can take.
Yeah, great, fantastic. Oh, Jessica is asking clarification on when to aerate the soil before or after seed application.
Yes, I would say in an area with compacted soil. So if you're living out in I don't know, like Maple Grove, somewhere where you know you've got that heavy clay soil and it can be really difficult to work, the more the merrier. But certainly the most beneficial time to do it would be prior to the seeding. It will really help allowing those new germinating plants to more easily set their roots. But generally speaking, aeration is really good for plant health in compacted soils. So I would say most critical just before seeding, but it'll never hurt you in a highly compacted soil.